Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. In this episode, we talk to Jamie Taylor about .NET Core. Jamie is a full-stack .NET developer with a focus on web cross-platform technologies. He lives and works in Leeds in the UK. He decided to learn .NET Core and chronicle his journey on his blog, which can be found at dotnet.gaprogman.com. That's dotnet core.gaprogman.com. And he has become the go-to guy at his workplace for .NET Core related questions. So welcome to the Cynical Developer, Jamie.
Thank you for having me on, James. This is it's quite exciting, I've got to say.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's been on my to-do list to go and look at for quite a long time now, and I've just not got around to doing anything with it. I've got a few little open source projects there that I want to work on and bring over to the core platform eventually. But I don't know a great deal about it, so we'll start off where we normally start these shows off with, and that is, what is .NET Core?
Okay, so .NET Core is a cross-platform open source re-implementation of the .NET framework. It's actively maintained by Microsoft and the community of developers over on GitHub. And it's kind of overseen by a group of companies called the .NET Foundation. At this year's Connect event, Google joined the .NET Foundation, and there are other companies like Samsung involved. So it's a pretty big, it's a big consortium. It's kind of like, I guess, it's a little like Android in that, everybody associates Google with Android, but there's all of the hardware guys and the other software companies involved. Like Snapdragon and Samsung and HTC and that kind of thing. So, there's a lot of companies involved in this. It's pretty interesting. Okay, I can go into a little bit of sort of history of .NET Framework for some of your listeners who may not know about it.
Yeah, because you mentioned then that it was a re-implementation of the .NET platform, and it's not like some of the other flavors out there of the .NET platform, such as C#, VB.NET, F#. They're not built on the same thing. They're actually a whole new stack then.
So in 1997, Steve Ballmer announced a technology called the NGWS, the Next Generation Web Services. And this was supposed to be like, web services for the future. And it's going to use XML to communicate with everything. And that would make it cross-platform. By 2002, it had been renamed to .NET. And there's a whole bunch of reasons behind that. But the chief amongst it being that at the time, a lot of the internet service providers, their top-level domains were .NET. So it was a way of kind of subconsciously linking this new technology to the internet and web services.
Right, so piggybacking on the domain names.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. And then in 2002, Microsoft released their next version of Visual Studio, which was named Visual Studio.NET. And this shipped with the .NET Framework 1.0, I believe. So that was, and it's been actively developed since then. We're currently at .NET Framework 4.6.1 is the current version. So obviously over the last, 14 years? Yeah, over the last 14 years, it's been actively developed and things have been added. So things like support for generic types and lists and collections and, all sorts of cool things like that.
Yeah, all the stuff that make .NET so much nicer to use than some of those other languages that are out there, that you just got the basic types and no real support for anything a little bit more complex.
Definitely. I mean, the other languages and frameworks all have their place, but .NET and especially C# and VB.NET have been developed with this idea of rapid application development. So you have a bunch of types and some basic functionality that you can just throw at your apps. So you have support for array lists or collections or tasks and threads and things like that just from the get-go, rather than, say, in C++, you might have to download a third-party library, or you'd have to, roll your own threads and things like that, which can get a bit it can get a bit difficult to do. Cross-thread programming is not easy at the best of times, and when you're having to write your own threads to do that with, it can get a bit difficult to do.
I used to explain .NET as pretend programming because so much of it is already done for us. We just hook it up straight out of the box and it works. When you start talking to hardware, it's a little bit different, but for the most part, somebody's probably already written something if it doesn't already exist in the core libraries.
Even huge chunks of the .NET framework now are written in C#. It's that really cool idea of like the GNU C compiler, which is one of the C compilers that's out there, one of the open source ones. That's written in C and then compiled with the GNU C compiler to get the new version, and then they compile the source code in the new version to like do a diff and compare and make sure that the two executables, the two binaries, are the same. And the same thing happens with .NET now. A huge portions of it are written in C# and with the .NET framework, and then sort of compiled through the .NET framework and through Roslyn, which is the C# compiler, and then out pops the new version, and then they do it again just to make sure they get the same sort of binary out. It's pretty clever.
I'm sure this is the start to Skynet.
It's funny you should say that. I'm wearing my Skynet development team T-shirt right now. Yeah.
Nice. We get that with some machine learning, and the world's over. So, if it's a reimagining of the .NET framework, does that mean that they're planning to replace the current .NET framework with Core, or is it something that's always going to sit alongside it?
Oh well, I mean, the idea is that the .NET framework is still going to be there for your Windows machines, your Windows servers, your Windows virtual machines on Azure, that kind of thing. And there's always going to be this cross-platform alternative option that you can run on a Linux virtual machine, or if you need to host something on Azure, but with a Linux box because they're slightly, maybe you're a Linux guy and, maybe you're a Linux system administrator and your developers are writing in C#, but you don't want to go through the process of learning how to run a Windows server and learning IIS, the Internet Information System, the Windows sort of web server. You can literally just go, okay, give me this binary. I'll put it through .NET Core. I'll get the Kestrel web server, which is .NET Core's web server, and I'll just put it I'll spin it up with a Docker image, throw it at Azure, and we have our web server ready. And I know how to run this. I might not know precisely how to run a Windows server with all of the IIS setup and things like that, you see. So I think the idea is to have, well, technically it's three. It's .NET Framework, .NET Core, and Xamarin, all sort of being interoperable. Yeah, interoperable, and offering different platforms that you can run your services and your applications on.
So .NET Standard is also out there. How does that link in with .NET Core? Is it related? Is it another reimagining of the .NET framework?
The way that the .NET Standard works is it's really interesting, actually. The day of recording this podcast, Emo Landsworth, one of the .NET project managers, actually released a bunch of YouTube videos where he discusses the .NET Standard and what it is and why it exists. The basic version is that .NET Framework has been around for 14 years, and it has a bunch of its own. It has its own base class library, and it has all of these types and all of these APIs that it supports. And along came Mono in the mid 2000s, which was started by one of the guys who started the GNOME project over for the Linux desktop environment.
Yeah.
It was started by Miguel de Icaza. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that.
That's about right.
Yeah, and he started the Linux GNOME desktop environment, and he sort of, in the mid 2000s, he got a bunch of developers together, and they created a white box copy of the .NET framework and named it Mono. That then evolved into Xamarin, which is it's a way of developing native apps for iOS and Android, but using C# and .NET.
We had Liam Mallon on from Rarely Impossible a few episodes ago talking about Xamarin. He gave us a good overview of that, and it fits in quite well, I think, with this .NET Core talk.
Yeah, and the idea is that these two, the .NET Framework and Xamarin, they both communicate with a common language infrastructure, the CLI, and they communicate with this underlying framework via their own base class libraries, which means that when Microsoft go, right, we're going to implement this new type, we're going to call it type foo, and it's going to have these methods available, it's going to communicate with these types in this way, then, they implement that in the .NET base class library, and then they have to go over to Mono and go, right, okay, we need to implement this in that base class library. And because they're both completely separate, there's anyone who's ever had to support two different platforms knows the pain of, well, I've upgraded this one, but now I have to go over here and upgrade that one as well. And you very quickly get out of sync. And now with .NET Core coming onto the scene, there's now technically three frameworks, three BCLs, three base class libraries to keep juggling and keep in the air and keep in sync. So the .NET standard is meant to, it is literally a standard. It's not a new framework. It's not a new library or anything like that. It's literally a list of, this is what a base class library has to be able to support to function with the .NET Framework and .NET Core and Xamarin and any other platforms that anybody wants to add to the ecosystem or that Microsoft decide to add to the ecosystem. And the idea is that there are different versions of the .NET standard, as there are with any other standard. And currently, we have .NET Standard 2.0, which is what .NET Framework 4.6 is ratified against. It's been .NET Standard 2.0 is based on the Framework 4.6.1, and the idea is that .NET Core is going to catch up with version 2 of the .NET Standard. And I believe it's going to be, they've got a release date of early 2017. So I'm not sure when. But that will be when .NET Core 1.2 is released. And once that's up to date, what I feel is going to happen from hearing discussions on other, in websites and other podcasts with Emo Landsworth and Scott Hunter and Scott Hanselman is that the way that it's engineered is .NET Core can have more frequent updates. So I think the idea is that .NET Core is going to eventually become the leader, and then things are going to be sent back down to .NET Framework and Xamarin, because the .NET Framework can't be updated as often as .NET Core, because the updates for .NET Framework have to be released at the same time as Windows updates.
Right, okay.
There's a lot of information there.
yeah, definitely. Does .NET Core support all of the languages in the .NET ecosystem?
Yes. They've actually, over the past few days, Microsoft have announced very early support for F#,
right,
which is their functional language. So, yeah, it's pretty exciting that you can, spin up I can spin up Visual Studio Code on my laptop and start coding something in C# or now F#, and just hit build, and out pops a cross-platform binary that I can run on this machine, or I can run on one of my work machines or anyone else's machine, so long as they have, the framework installed. It's pretty exciting.
So that's C# and F# support. Is there VB.NET support?
I'll be completely honest with you. I've not played with VB.NET, even with the .NET Framework. So that's one I'm not too sure on.
You are a very, very lucky man. So we were talking that it's cross-platform, and I guess that's using the PCLs, the portable class libraries. Does that mean that it does work very well and plays nicely with Unity, UWP, and Xamarin? Yeah,
of course. As long as so the way it works is any class library that's written for .NET Core needs to explicitly target .NET Standard version 1.6. And so long as it does, then Unity or Xamarin or UWP will actually just load them and work with them without a problem. The problem will be is if you if you target a lower version, an earlier version of the standard, which is entirely possible. You can target, I believe, as far down as version 1.3 of the .NET standard with .NET Core. If you target any of those, it's not going to load in Unity, Xamarin, or UWP. But as long as it's 1.6, it will be loaded, and it won't. There will be APIs and types missing. There's a website that you can go to that again Emo Landsworth spun up the other day. It's APIsof.net, so that's APISOF.net, and that will show you which versions of .NET Core, Xamarin, or the .NET Framework you can use to utilize that method or type or anything like that. So, there's ways of figuring out which types are available where. There's just at the moment, there's a subset. .NET Core is currently a subset of the .NET Framework, but it's going to catch up very soon.
So if I wanted to write something in normal .NET, then I could write it in a PCL and then use it with .NET Core and everywhere else, as long as I was targeting the correct framework.
That's exactly it, yep. Target the right version of the .NET standard, then you can load your .NET Framework library into a .NET Core application, and the other way around as well. So it is fully cross-platform so long as you currently target the correct version of the .NET standard. But early next year, that's not really going to be a problem because .NET Core will be on the same level as the .NET Framework.
No, that's fantastic. That's good that everything is meeting at a decent standard, and we're not going to have a lot of things that lagging behind. If I wanted to sit down and write something in .NET Core, do I need the latest version of Visual Studio, so 2015, or could I get away with using any of the older versions?
You see, that's a very interesting question. You don't even have to use Visual Studio. You can use Visual Studio. At which point you will need Visual Studio 2015 Update 3. It doesn't matter whether you use the Community Edition, which is the free version of Visual Studio, or all the way up to the Enterprise one, which is very not free. But the Update 3 comes with all of the templates and the tooling for .NET Core version 1.1. Update 2 for Visual Studio 2015 has basic support for .NET Core, but there are still a few things that are not quite right with it. So you can use that, or I personally use Visual Studio Code on. I've got a MacBook Air, and I just spin up Visual Studio Code, and I use a Yeoman generator. So there's obviously Node.js. Yeoman is a templating engine that can sit on top of Node.js, and I can 3 or 4 commands, and I've got the folder structure and config files for a .NET Core project ready to go.
Oh, nice.
So that takes all the pain out of setting it all up. If I had to do it manually, obviously I'd have to manually create a project JSON and a settings.json and create a bunch of files to represent each of the things, but like the startup.cs, and have to hard code all of that, whereas all of this is taken care of in the Yeoman generator. So push a few buttons and it's all ready to go. You just start programming away. It's almost like I'm using Visual Studio with its file new project setup.
Sure. Is that available on all the different platforms then that you can develop for?
Oh, definitely. I mean, .NET Core 1.1, which was released on the 25th of October, has support for, let's see, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, CentOS, Debian, Fedora, Linux Mint, OpenSUSE, Oracle Linux, Ubuntu 14.04, Mac OS X 10.11 onwards, Windows 7 onwards, Windows Server 2012 onwards, Windows Nano Server, and Windows Server. And Visual Studio Code is available for all of those platforms.
With the latest announcement that we're going to have Visual Studio for Mac as well. So even those people from over there are going to be able to taste the goodness of .NET finally in a proper IDE, because we are very, very well looked after with Visual Studio.
We really are. We really are. It is a fantastic experience. Just all of the tools that are all built into it, and you literally have everything you need. It's even down to Visual Studio 2015 has a diagnostics tab that you can, as you're sending SQL commands, as you're sending link commands, you can see the SQL that's generated and how long it's taking to run that against the database. It's very, very, very fantastic.
So I've got a couple of open source libraries that or projects that I've been working on. If I wanted to port those over to .NET Core, is there any way that I can check to make sure that they can come across? Because I don't believe that everything is currently supported in the .NET Core that you get with the normal framework, or has that recently changed? Is it closer to full coverage now?
It's getting there. That's what I mean. It's getting there. It's currently .NET Core 1.1 is as close as we're going to get, as far as I can tell, until this early 2017 release date of .NET Core 1.2. But there are, like I say, there are websites you can use. Some of them are Microsoft created, like APIs of .NET, and there's one iCanHas.net, which is pretty cool. Not very well. To use iCanHas.net, you have to upload a full Visual Studio solution to it, and it will search through your solution and tell you which libraries will work and which libraries won't.
Right.
My only problem, of course, with that is that I'm handing over all of my source code to a web service, and I don't know what it's doing with it.
And you could be in a massive breach there of data protection and IP protection and things like that if you're doing it with your businesses or your company's code as well. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at that. But those two websites that we've mentioned, we'll put in the show notes as well, so you don't need to quickly scribble down those URLs.
Of course.
What sort of applications should I be looking at building with .NET Core? Is there anything different, anything special compared to the normal .NET framework?
It's an interesting question though, because there's a little bit that you need to be thinking about. For instance, with the Web API and MVC things, with those projects, the web server Kestrel runs in a slightly different way to how IIS runs. So the way that IIS works is you have a bunch of components which you have written. So you might have an authentication layer and a database layer and a controller layer that will generate a view or some kind of payload. So your request will come into IIS. It will go through all of these steps until it can generate a response. The response will be generated, but then it will be put back through the same process, if that makes sense. So if your request came in and did authentication, then database access, and then a controller, and then generated a response, the response would go authentication, database, controller again before it's sent out.
Yep.
Whereas Kestrel has this idea of middleware. So you still have those steps in the middle. So you still have your authentication and your database and maybe your logging and maybe a controller and all that kind of things all the way till you generate a response. But each step along the way, each of these pieces of middleware can generate their own response and can deal with the request. So your request comes in, it hits authentication, user is authenticated, goes through to logging perhaps, and then goes through to the database layer. If the service for the database either doesn't exist or the database table doesn't exist or some other condition, then the database layer, the middleware, can actually generate a response and send it out. The rest of the middleware is left untouched. You don't have to climb all the way up the ladder to climb all the way back down again.
Right.
Which is pretty, it's a big change. And it's bi-directional. So as your request comes in, it will go up the ladder. And then when it gets to the point where a request is generated, it comes back down the ladder in the reverse order. So if you did authentication, database, logging, controller, but it was dealt with in database, it will either go straight out from database or it will go back to authentication, then it will go out. So there's a little bit of a learning curve to get your head around that your middleware could generate a valid response and send it out. before it gets to your controller.
Right, so it sort of breaks out of the code at that point and says, "Oh, there was a problem, and this is the HTTP response I'm going to send out."
That's precisely it. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah. But other than that, you can still do the same kinds of projects. You can still generate the same kinds of projects that you could with the full version of .NET Framework. Sorry, you can do Web API, or you can do MVC. You could do console applications. The only things that you can't do at the moment are Universal Windows applications, the UWP stuff, because I'm not sure whether that's coming in, and there's nothing in there for forms at the moment, so there aren't any WinForms or anything. Right. But there are third-party libraries you can use that sort of sit on top of .NET Core that allow you to generate forms on, say, an Ubuntu box or a Mac OS box. So you might be able to get a version of, say, Qt or something. There's different libraries that you can use, that you can hook in and generate your forms, because obviously you want to separate your business logic from your forms anyway. So you can just swap those out as and when you need to.
Yeah.
And because of that, I'm currently working on a Web API project that uses Entity Framework Core, which is the next generation of Entity Framework, and it's cross-platform as well. But there's a learning curve with that too. I found out the other day, in that it doesn't get. So Entity Framework allows you to describe your database as a bunch of classes, and with certain mappings between them. And what's great about that is you can say, right, database, give me all of the book records that you have, and include any author notes, and it will just bring that back for you. Whereas Entity Framework Core, you have to explicitly say, I want the book records, and I want you to actually go out and get me the author records as well, because otherwise they call them the navigation properties, a foreign key between the book record and an author will not be followed, and it will not traverse that and get the other record, which I found out the other day. But apparently that's coming in the next version.
Right, that's the lazy loading that it's missing at this point.
That's it, yeah. Yeah, that's it.
So how does that deal with different database systems? Because on the whole, you're probably using Entity Framework to talk to Microsoft SQL. I could be very, very wrong here, but I don't believe that SQL runs on any other platform. So am I wrong, or does the core understand that it's not on the right box, it's on a different technology, and the database isn't a SQL database this time, and it will automatically switch over?
Well, you're kind of half right in both aspects. When you're using Entity Framework Core, you have to explicitly state which type of database you're going to use. So it will load in the correct toolings and the correct middleware to communicate with your SQL Server or a SQLite or a MySQL database. I believe there's a MongoDB one as well, so that's pretty cool. So yeah, you will have to say, you will have to at compile time say, right, include this library for, say, SQLite. One of the projects I'm working on uses SQLite because, like I say, I'm on my Mac, so I can't really use SQL Server.
Rather than having the database system installed on the server, you just have the drivers and the libraries locally in the application to say, this is the database we're using, and this is how you talk to it.
That's precisely it, yeah. And on the other half of that question, SQL Server is available for certain Linux distributions as well. Well, it will be very soon. The next version of SQL Server is going to get released for, I believe it's the Debian-based Linux distribution. So you're talking Debian and Ubuntu and maybe Ubuntu Mate and Linux Mint, things like that. Right. So there is a version that is, actively being developed for Linux, which is quite exciting.
Yeah.
But I think, again, that goes hand in hand with Microsoft trying to get it. I think their byline is any developer, any app, anywhere.
Yeah, the any platform, any developer, any application was pointed out to us by one of our previous guests, and Microsoft really are coming full force with this now, and they're bringing everything with it. Prior to the .NET Core, I'd have people ask me, what technology should I get into? Should I do Java? Should I do .NET? What should I do? And I'd always say, oh, well, .NET's pretty good because you've got Windows and you've got the web, so you're targeting a lot of platforms there. But now it's Windows, it's Mac, it's Linux, it's the web, it's mobile. It's pretty much everything that you want to do is now supported. So I think unless something catastrophically goes wrong or or technology changes hugely, I think the .NET framework is going to be around for a lot longer than some people may have hoped.
Even just to really quickly add to that, you've also got IoT devices, because that's coming in 1.2 of .NET Core, and you also have Samsung smart TVs. At this year's Connect event, Samsung announced that their Tizen platform, Tizen, that now supports .NET Core. And Scott Hanselman actually ran a .NET Core app on a Samsung smart TV live in front of everyone.
He's a brave man.
Yeah, he really is. Braver than I am.
Yeah, and he wasn't put off by Samsung showing him adverts on his smart TV that he didn't sign up for.
Exactly, and his TV didn't explode either, so that's good.
Yeah, well, that's only happened to me. I'm a bit of a Samsung fanboy. All my monitors in front of me are all Samsung. My TVs are all Samsung. I've only had one explode on me in all the years, so it's not too bad. At least it wasn't in my pocket like a phone or anything like that.
Exactly right. Exactly.
So the .NET Core is an open source project. Does that mean that I can go out and build something for the core and have it contributed? So maybe there's something missing that I think, I can do that. I've got some speciality in that area. I'll go and do that, and a pull request or whatever to them with my changes.
Oh, definitely. At this year's Connect event, Scott Hanselman, who is obviously PM of community outreach, he actually said that over 60% of the pull requests for .NET Core came from developers outside of Microsoft. So that's people in the community or people at the .NET Foundation, all coming together and trying to make .NET and .NET Core better. It's not just Microsoft that's working on this anymore. It's kind of all of us.
Yeah, was that the same time when he posted the nice shiny medallions for the OS?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's a really cool thing that he's doing. Is they're called challenge coins, and there's a bunch of podcasts doing them at the moment for subscribers and things, for supporters. Sorry, and the idea is that if you have a pull request that is accepted by Microsoft and merged into the code base, they can send you a challenge coin out, which is really cool.
Yeah.
I desperately want one.
Yeah, they were really, really nice, and it made me sit up and pay attention. I thought, I wonder if there's something I could do. I want one of those.
Yeah, exactly. It's brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely is. We're easily tempted and distracted by shiny objects, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah, the .NET Core, one thing I sort of heard about was that it has a different project file, a JSON project file.
Mm-hmm.
But that's possibly changing and going back to the XML-based versions?
It is, yeah. The initial version of .NET Core used a project.json file to configure your application and to tell it which dependencies and frameworks to pull down and where the libraries were. Say you might be including a custom library that you're not pulling down from NuGet or from some other source, and that was all included there, as well as the connection strings for your database and things like that. The stuff that you would find in a .NET Framework CS proj file, or in the web.config if you have a web.config in your CS proj.net solution. So what's happened is, Microsoft released .NET Core and said, hey, we're going to support this in MS Build, and Octopus is going to support it, and Cake and Make and all of these different build engines. And they all went, do we really have to add support for this JSON format? Can't we use the CS proj format that we all know?
Yeah, change is bad. Don't change on us.
Yeah, pretty much. So to make it easier for for the entire build tool chain, the idea is that with .NET Core 1.2, there's going to be a bunch of tools to help you convert your project JSON files into CSproj files, which are all, like you say, they're all XML based. And that will then, it will then be easier for all of the build tools to pick those up and to run with them than having to write a new parser for a new format, which is only supported on one platform.
Yeah.
Whereas, the .NET Framework and Xamarin both use this CSproj file format. So why have this outlier,
Yeah, probably just trying to get rid of what they're considering to be an old technology and replace it with JSON that's a little bit more lightweight. But we can be sticklers with that sort of stuff and just want to use what we know. But speaking about just using what we know, if I want to actually learn some more about .NET Core, or the listeners want to learn something more about it, have you got any good suggestions for places to go to actually learn about .NET Core, how to build my first app, and maybe some training courses, that sort of stuff?
Oh, definitely. The first place I would start would be the official documentation. And I could send you a link to that if you like to put that in the show notes. And that is actually built off of a GitHub repository. So you can actually put a pull request in for the documentation, which is pretty interesting. I don't think Microsoft have ever done that before. There's a lot of frameworks out there that do, but I think this is new for Microsoft. And every time you go to the website, it has a version of the GitHub repository already built and formatted, and it just serves you that. I believe it changes every 24 hours. There are a bunch of Microsoft Virtual Academy courses that you can take. These are all free. Some of them have like multiple guest questions at the end of each section. But there's a brilliant one been put up very recently by Scott Hanselman and Maria Nagaga. I'm sure I got that name wrong, and I do apologize. But that one's called Introduction to ASP.NET Core 1.0. And again, I can send a link if you like. There are a few pretty good Pluralsight courses as well. There's one called ASP.NET Core 1.0 Fundamentals by Scott Allen. That takes about 5 hours, and he talks you through what the middleware is and how the startup.cs works and how that's changed. He breaks each chunk down, which is pretty nice, and it's more of a theoretical, these are the things that have changed. And there's also one that I really like that's a bit more tutorially, a bit more follow this and we'll build something, which is building a web app with ASP.NET Core, MVC6, EF Core, and Angular. It's a really long title.
That's a nice snappy
by
one.
Sean. Oh, yeah. You can roll that off the tongue in the bar straight away. And that one's by Sean Wildermuth.
Wildermuth.
That's the one, Wildermuth, yeah. And that's all Pluralsight as well. That's a little longer. That's about 9.5 hours. But it is pretty detailed. And, when he needs to take a step back and go, right, now we're going to learn about the middleware, he'll take a moment to teach you about it, and then he'll come back to where he was. But you will have a fully built MVC site with authentication, and he covers a little bit of Angular as well for the front end. All of that, all in one tutorial. So that's pretty nice.
Yeah, fantastic. So we'll get all those links into the show notes, so listeners can go and have a look at those and possibly learn a little bit more and get involved with the .NET Core. So we're almost out of time, and I'd just like to thank you for coming on the show. It's been good, and it's definitely something I'm going to go away and have a look at now, and maybe start porting some of my open source projects over onto it as a bit of an experiment, and see how badly they crash and burn.
Yeah, that's what happened when I first started porting some of my stuff. But it's a learning experience,
It is, and any dev that you meet that tells you that they know everything, they're not the sort of devs that you want to keep around, because we're all learning.
Exactly.
And things are changing so quickly that we can't know everything. But with this podcast, I'm going to provide our listeners with that little bit more information and make them a little bit more savvy. So again, thanks for coming on.
And thank you for having me on, James. It's been loads of fun.
Yeah, it's been good to have you on. And to all the listeners, we shall speak to you soon. Thanks. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform and help the Cynical Developer to grow by increasing its audience. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website, where you can find all the resource links and show notes for each episode.